Okay, we are recording. Good morning to everyone, and welcome to History Matters, and so does coffee. Um, Today, what we're going to talk about, and I couldn't figure out the best title for it, so I'll have a much better time explaining it today. I know that in past weeks, months, over the course of the last year, some of you have asked about sessions, episodes that talk a little bit about the hows of history, like how we do it, or what I do, or how I do it, or whatever. And I've kind of resisted that. And then for today, it kind of occurred to me a way to do it, at least in one little way that I could kind of tie to the present. And so that's what I want to do. And the specific how that I wanted to talk about today is how seemingly trivial little details can reveal so much about history. Some over the years that I found that, and they're the kind of thing that sticks in my brain, but how they've let me decode a moment and to talk a little bit about that in the past and then to talk a little bit about that in the present. But before I plunge into that, I now turn to my partner in crime, Matt, who shall tell us the rules of the game.
Rules of the game are as follows. As always, please use chat. We love chat. Chat is wonderful. We love hearing from you, and we can't see your smiling, wonderful faces on the screen, but we can enjoy your conversation in chat. Just please keep it germane to the conversation and, of course, family friendly. If you do have questions for Joanne, please put those in the Q&A. I do take the questions from the Q&A because it's a lot easier to track those because I'll lose them in chat because you're also loquacious is not the right word, but something along those lines. So if you could put those in Q&A, that would be terrific. And as always, my weekly threat, which is if you don't ask questions, I will be forced to. And Joanne, it's just not fair to Joanne.
And I contradict you every week.
Yes,
So.
you do. Yes, you do. If excuse me. And then, of course, if you do like what we do here at National Council for History Education, please join us. We are on the web at www.ncheteach.org, and you can click around, click join, become a member, go to our past episodes where are all up on there, as we were just saying right before we started recording, and lots of other great content. We're going to be building out that content this summer, so look for some significant changes and some things that some new additions and all kinds of good stuff. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Joanne and we shall get going for the day.
Excellent. Okay. Well, again, welcome, folks who weren't here before, to History Matters. Let me just, once again, tweak the view. Okay. There we go. Okay. To History Matters, and so does coffee. As I said just a moment ago, I want to talk about how small details can reveal big things. Sometimes big things about a person, sometimes big things about the past. I'm going to do a little bit of both today. And then I'm going to at least touch on ways in which they will help us decode the present. It's always true. And if you think about your life or the lives of people you know, I'm sure you can think of seemingly small individual decisions you made. And by small, I mean like the clothes you picked one morning, or how you chose to say hello to someone, or some weird little habit you have, or what you said in front of a famous person, some weird little thing like that that might not often even get recorded, but that shows a lot either about you or about the moment. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about actually comes from diaries and personal accounts, because this is the sort of thing that does not get written down. And I talked many moons ago, like the third or fourth or fifth episode, a year ago, more than a year ago, about diaries as sources of information. Obviously, given that I'm always really interested in people in the past and sort of how being present in a past moment and the emotion of that and the reality of that shapes their politics. Given that interest, diaries are great. And I know I've talked over the last year plus about a lot of diaries, and you're going to get more today. But at any rate, that's the idea of what I want to talk about. And over the years, I have a memory that remembers written correspondence and diaries, remembers evidence, primary evidence, from the 18th century particularly, really, really, really well. And so a lot of these details are in my brain. And to be totally honest, I sat down this morning to begin to prepare, and I thought, let's see, like, which of this plethora of anecdotes in my head actually have deeper meaning, and I'll get to talk about it too. So that's some of what you're going to be getting, but it's certainly true. As I was reviewing in my mind this morning, details that I've come across as a historian in the past, there are a lot of them. They're everywhere. You know, they're just not what you look for. So, for example, somewhere or other in the past, actually in William McClay's diary, he talks about what people are snacking on around him in Congress, in the Senate, which is not a particularly important fact, but how else would you know? And I believe they were eating like oranges, I think is what his diary said. I've come across over the years people's dreams. Sometimes they'll write down their dreams in a diary. That's really revealing. Toys they buy for their kids, parenting, some of the things that they do as parents, all of these things, if you're talking about sort of broad, conventional, important history, which obviously is not all of history by far, those are the things that certainly typically get tossed to the side. Even if you come down off that high horse and you're addressing history more broadly, those sorts of things aren't often included. And we're going to talk a little bit today about little examples and what they show. One example of this, which is not necessarily something I found, I'm just going to move chat out of the way because I always want to engage with you guys. Something that I didn't find on my own, but that actually was in a book. Let's see if I can remember it. What I brilliantly didn't do was write down Rhys Isaac, his book on Virginia, and the title I have lost, and someone out there will know it. So anyway, Rhys Isaac wrote a classic book on Virginia, early American Virginia. And Rhys is R-H-Y-S in this case. And towards the beginning of the book, he talks about a man and a woman riding in a carriage in the countryside in the South in Virginia. And he talks about the fact how essentially in that carriage, when men travel and look around them, particularly if they're traveling around near where they live, they look for ownership. Like, that's so-and-so's farm, that's so-and-so's plantation, that's so-and-so's. And so when they give people directions, they're focused on ownership. In other words, maleness. And that when women tended to give directions or tend to review the countryside, they talk about landmarks, like with the big tree and the huge rock, which makes perfect sense. It's hardly something that's going to make your jaw drop with surprise, but it's such a subtle way of getting at big differences in mindset, just of men and women in early America and how they understood their world. That's the kind of thing that, obviously, I read that my first semester in grad school, and probably not since, and that was 1992. And it stayed in my head all these years because it felt to me, although in and of itself not vital, such a revealing little glimpse of the mental landscape of what people had in the past. So that's the kind of thing I want to talk about. A couple minor examples, again, that feel totally trivial when you come across them and then you realize what's going on. And this one truly seemed trivial, and it wasn't until I sat down this morning and began trying to write down examples. I have like a nice little list of examples, which you can't see. I was thinking about William McClay, whose diary, if you're ever interested in reading a diary, there actually is a version online at a website that you can find, A Century of Lawmaking, I think is it. It's an old edition, so it's not totally up to date, and it's missing some things, but William McClay's diary is just a diary, so it's not necessarily easy reading, but it's really fascinating. He talks in his diary about a member of Congress, a senator, very, a sort of pompous senator who wore very fine clothing and clearly was adopting, a persona of a certain kind, Southern land-holding important guy. And apparently, in this day when McClay happened to be standing next to him when the Senate adjourned, the guy, and right now I can't remember his name because I didn't have time to look it up. I probably will remember it like in 3 hours. He apparently had called a carriage to take him from the Senate to wherever he was going, which was a little extreme. You know, he could have walked, but the carriage was taking a really long time to get there. So the way Maclay tells it is Mr. So-and-so said he called a carriage, but he kept waiting and waiting and the carriage wasn't coming. And people started to ask him, why don't you just walk? And he suddenly announced that he was lame. He had a limp today, so he couldn't make the walk, which Maclay says is a total lie. But what's fascinating is this guy was so focused on making the right appearance, even though the people around him, like, were with him all day and saw that he wasn't limping. He wanted to be in that carriage. He didn't want to lose face after calling it by not waiting for it. That just was such a tiny little glimpse of a Southern slave-holding gentleman and the front, the facade of who you are and what you wanted to seem like. Minor thing. I mean, Maclay puts it in his diary because he doesn't like the guy. He's like, ah. I think there's even like a portrait of the guy in the edition of Maclay's diary that I have. At any rate, an example of the tiny kind of detail that in this case tells you about the facade of a Southern slaveholder and how much of a facade it was, but also how important it was. Another totally minor little detail stuck in my head all these years. I've actually never used it, I think, in anything I've written. And I'm working now on a book that's kind of about history, and Hamilton is like a case study of something, so it probably will appear in there. It's from the memoirs of one of Hamilton's sons. And several of them go on to become prominent in public life. This one has a brief introductory section, like an opening chapter or two, about, growing up in the Hamilton house. And one of the things that he says in there is that once the Grange, Hamilton, is the only house Hamilton owned, which now is up in Harlem, and he got in, I think they moved in like 1802 or something. He only had 2 years there, but it was like their country home. And the son said that their father would play with them in their country home by teaching them to military march. And first of all, I love that because that is kind of a thing a particular kind of dad might do with sons. So on the one hand, it's, seeing some famous person in a different light is interesting. What I find interesting about it is Hamilton is so enamored of the military and was so over eager to grab at it when anything that felt like disorder appeared. The fact that he's teaching his kids to march like soldiers just felt to me like I couldn't use it in a book as evidence, like, see how militaristic he is, but I could say, here's a habit of his, a thing he did that offers a glimpse maybe of how he thought. And it's a revealing one. I have chat away. I can't see how you're responding, but I've remembered it for decades because it felt to me like this weird little tiny revealing thing that has something to do with his policies and his politics and what kind of a leader he was. Another example, totally minor, I actually write about it in my last book, and it's from Benjamin Brown French's diary, and he was very had a lot to do in the Lincoln White House. He was the commissioner of public buildings, so he was in and out of the White House, and he had a lot of dealings with Lincoln. So he tells a story in his diary about being in a room in the White House with Lincoln and a bunch of other official folk, cabinet members and important politicians. And Lincoln was at a desk, like finishing writing something before he turned around to engage with everybody. And in the middle of writing, he paused and he said out loud to the room, "Anyone here know how to spell missile? I don't know how to spell missile." And someone told him and he wrote it down. Benjamin Brown French wrote that down because to him, it did the same thing as the sorts of things that I'm talking about today. He writes in his diary, "Now look at that guy." And French knew every president since Andrew Jackson up and beyond Lincoln. And he says in his diary, "Look at that guy. I don't know another president who would be like, 'Hey guys, I can't spell this. Anybody got it?'" Like he greatly appreciated what he saw as Lincoln's humility. And that to him was like the characteristic sort of thing, which again, a guy, the president sitting at a desk and asking help with spelling is hardly an important moment. And in and of itself, you don't need it to understand anything, but it reveals so much. Actually, in my case, it revealed about Lincoln and then about French, that he liked it so much that he reported on it. But again, a great detail, the kind of thing that in this case can reveal character, but these sorts of details can reveal much more, kind of along the lines of the Southern slaveholder and the carriage. This isn't just a matter of character, although if you're writing about people and looking at history as people making choices or not being able to make choices, anything that gives you insight into their mental landscape is helpful, even if it seems minor. Now, I want to mention here, I want to talk about a couple instances that are kind of interwoven. Little trivial details, all about, I guess, one person and people around that person, just to give you a sense, and two of them are things that I found. In one case, it was public knowledge, and the other I just don't know, but I certainly, when I saw it, I kind of interpreted it as having meaning. And then the other one, there's a book about it, a great book about it. But let me do this because I think it'll show you a little bit of what I'm talking about in recreating people and moments. I want to talk a little bit about George Washington. Now, Washington, the non-existent cherry tree. There are certainly enough stories about Washington, and as we're getting in recent decades more open to all kinds of realities and not just heroic ones, or at least we should be, and more people are. But in the case of Washington, there's all kinds of interesting things and fascinating things about him as a slaveholder being revealed, in addition to a variety of other things about him. And the things we've known in the past about, being the general and being the first president and setting precedents. We know those things, but that's hardly a full way of looking at him or any person or American history. Okay, so when I was working on my first book, I came across, it was either in a diary or a personal letter, an account of someone who was with Washington at dinner during his presidency. I think it was early in the presidency, and Washington was with the group of people. Someone knocked at the door, and Washington, before going to the door, went upstairs, changed into a black suit, and came downstairs and met the person at the door and engaged with them. And then that ended, and he went upstairs and took off the black suit and came back downstairs and went back to the party. And to me, he was putting on his president's suit, right? This was someone who was going to engage him as president, so he put on the president's suit. And if you think to yourself about every portrait you've ever seen of Washington from his presidency, he's always in the black suit, right? I mean, that is the president's suit with a sword. But that to me was remarkably revealing about him trying to process the presidency, revealing about the presidency itself as an office that people are kind of trying to figure out. It was revealing about a whole bunch of things, again, which is why I've remembered it all these years. He's trying to fashion the presidency and himself, and thinking partly of himself and thinking partly of broader implications. Along the same lines, and I know I've tweeted about this before, and this I didn't discover, but when I saw it, it stuck with me for obvious reasons, as you'll hear in a moment. So I saw at Mount Vernon Washington's copy of the Constitution, or at least one of his copies of the Constitution, which obviously that's fascinating, but because he wrote in it, right? But what struck me was a lot of the writing in the margins was everywhere in the Constitution where it mentioned something that the president was responsible for, he wrote in the margin, like with brackets, bracketing the section very carefully, president. He read through the Constitution to catch the moments that listed what the job was supposed to be. Think about that for a moment. Think about how little people could assume about what the heck a president was, how little they knew about how the Constitution was going to work, how much it mattered because everyone was expecting him to act like a king, the degree to which he took all of that seriously enough to read the rules when he took the office. I mean, I find that fascinating and revealing of that moment in time, and kind of touching because it's harkening back to a moment when at least some people were thinking about implications of leadership and the importance of the Constitution, which are fine things to value and all too often not. But so those are some seemingly positive Washington things. Now I want to talk about a different Washington thing. And this has to do with Ona Judge, who was someone who Washington enslaved. There's a great book by Erica Dunbar called Never Caught that writes about Ona Judge. And a couple interesting things when I was rummaging around and trying to decide what I wanted to say about this morning. This is another way of getting at Washington, and it's going to offer a very different image of him, but it's also going to give you an image of Ona Judge. And the thing is, I'm blathering here happily about letters and diaries, and the fact of the matter is, obviously, wealthy white men are going to be the people who leave behind the most evidence. And so when you go to an archive, there are, as many historians are writing about now and exploring now, there are so many holes in the archives and so many ways in which you have to be hyper creative to find people or find moments in archives that are full of writings by elite white men. One of the things that's always interesting and useful, and in this case, that's what this is when people live long enough for people to understand that this person had significance and they interviewed them. And in the case of Ona Judge, in 1845, she was interviewed about her time with the Washingtons. And so she, what you get is, and this is what one of the wonderful things that Erica Dunbar was using in her book. Granted, it's distant in time, it's decades later, all of the qualifications you need to make for that reason, but I just want to read you a little bit of it because probably this is true. Even if it isn't, it's close to probably what happened, and it just gives you an insight into her at a moment in time, and in this case, the moment in time when she decided to flee the Washingtons. This is according to the person who interviewed her. Now, of course, we also don't know how accurate that person was, so even more qualifiers, but still. Here's the quote, supposedly from her. Whilst they, the Washingtons, were packing up to go to Virginia, I was packing to go. So I think this is when the Washingtons were going back to Mount Vernon. I think this is at the end of the presidency. And she says, I was packing to go. They're packing to go to Virginia. I'm packing to go, but not to Virginia. I didn't know where, for I knew that if I went back to Virginia, I should never get my liberty. So they're in Philadelphia here. I had friends among the colored people of Philadelphia, had my things carried there beforehand, and left Washington's house while they were eating dinner. Seemingly trivial information, but here's this woman, knows that this family is going to go back to Virginia, knows that this might be her one chance to grab at freedom before going back more deeply into slavery territory, waits for a moment when everyone is packing to pack her own things, has her things sent somewhere, and then waits till people are busy eating and flees. Like the process of her thinking, the intensity of that moment that you can kind of feel in the way in which she's making this plan and what she's describing as like, this is it for me, do or die, it had to be now. The risk entailed in it, even though she's not talking about that, that's just a remarkable little detail that doesn't offer, in this instance, history-changing revelations, except it kind of does. It's an enslaved person's, or a formerly enslaved person's, memory of fleeing slavery in their words, or close to their words. That's pretty remarkable. I mean, that's pretty remarkable, which is part of why Erica Dunbar's book is interesting and very much worthy of reading. And it's also, a lot of what Annette Gordon-Reed does with her work on Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson, filling some of the holes in the archives. And when you start to fill in the holes, you really see the world in a very different way. You get away from the guy in the president's suit sitting at a table, genteel table, and instead you get a guy who did not want this woman to leave and would have restrained her by force if he'd known that she was leaving. Now, that brings us to the second point, which is that apparently Washington, according to letters he wrote at the time, couldn't understand why she fled. In his words, that she was brought up and treated more like a child than a servant. So he's not comprehending what being enslaved really means, which isn't surprising, but still, like, we treated her so nicely. We treated her like a child. Why would she want to leave us? And then he says she must have been seduced and enticed away by someone. So she would never want to leave us. We treated her so well. Someone else, some man, must have drawn her away, which tells you a lot, not just about Washington, but certainly about Washington, noble leader, slaveholder, and someone who is not really able to understand on a pretty basic level why someone would flee slavery. Jefferson shows some of that in Notes on the State of Virginia as well. Just can't see it. Don't want to see it, actually, more likely. The other interesting thing that tells you something about Washington is that 3 years after she escaped, 3 years later, he's still trying to capture her. The subtitle of Erica Dunbar's book, I can't remember, but it's something like the never-ending quest, Washington's never-ending quest to try and, recapture Ona Judge. He tried, so 3 years. She's in New Hampshire, I think. She's living in New Hampshire. She's, I think she marries, she has children. He's still tracking her down for monetary reasons, for reasons of personal pride, who the heck knows. But I gave you one image of Washington, and I've given you another image of Washington, and they're all Washington, and they're all part of the story, and they need to be. So nothing so far that I've talked about today is major in the sense that, and then on this date, so-and-so signed this, or, so-and-so said that day in Congress, whatever the things are that tend to be the threads woven into the way we understand history. None of that is here. But, history is humanity. As I suggested at the outset, history is people making choices or being prevented from making choices. But one way or another, if you can uncover some of the fiber of past peoples, acknowledging all of the ways in which it might be inaccurate, it might be false, it might be misleading, all of the things that as a historian, we're trained to think about. So you can't just accept something and say, wow, it's revealing. You then have to go through the whole process of figuring out if it's worth believing. But if you can actually find a piece of evidence that offers you a sense of the fiber of people or a person in the past, that little bit of information can make known facts, known people, known history look really different. It's part of why, well, it's one of many reasons why, the travesty of acting as though somehow or other we don't and shouldn't teach about slavery, American slavery in schools. I'm not even going to go in that direction because my brain will implode. But that's talking about huge, sweeping, misleading change. Bring it down a level even and think about all the ways in which all these kinds of things that I'm focusing on, that way of looking at things, we don't get that. Not that in school, when you're in school, and so many of you are teachers that I'm sure you're like, when would I have time to teach whatever? But sprinkling some of these things into moments in history, even when you're teaching, which I do all the time, is a way to drive a point home and make it real, make history real. And I think that's a huge part of what historians and teachers need to be doing. Now, I always connect what I'm talking about to the present. I'll do that really quickly now so that then I can open things up for questions. I think very, very often about what historians in the future are going to be looking at when they're looking at now, and what small details, if I were a historian writing, would I remember? And there are two, and I will say flat out, I didn't check them. So this is based on Freeman memory, which is not always a good thing. But I think I have a pretty good feeling that they're true. And if not, they're an example of the kind of thing. But I remember reading years ago that, talking about snack foods, that President Obama would have as a snack 9 almonds. Not just almonds, 9 almonds, that he counted them out. That to me is such a revealing thing about a person. It's not like he's dieting or I don't know, he's allergic to almonds. I mean, he's just that kind of a disciplined character who kept track of even what he ate, sort of was, in line with what he wanted it to be. And I can see how some people in positions of leadership would want a certain amount of reliability in their lives, but this is something more than that. This tells you something about his character, which I won't plunge into. But as a historian in the future, trying to figure him out, I would store that up in my brain and see when it might connect with something else I learned about him to sort of clinch something that I'm thinking about Obama. Another example of that is something I read a long time ago in an essay in the New York Times that said, even as a young man, President Clinton, had a file box in which he had filed cards that he made one for each person he met. So that he could know, like, who did I meet? Who were they? He could remember that information. And why that stayed in my head is because think about being the person that thinks to do that, right? You're assuming it's going to be important to know who these people are, and it'll be really good. It'll give you an advantage if you can remember who they are. And I mean, in 1,000 years, it would never have occurred to me in my 20s to do something like that. And I don't even know if he was that old. I don't remember when in his life, but he was very young. It might have been when he was at Oxford. At any rate, that to me is another one of these details that it tells you a lot. In that case, if that's true, about ambition and assumptions about his future. Really interesting fact. Now, the last thing I'll mention here, because I'm blathering over time, it's actually something that I read this morning, which then brought me back to the events of January 6th. So, we're at this moment where people are denying some of what happened on January 6th, rewriting what happened on January 6th, pretending like, it was peaceful, there was like tourists, whatever the insanity that people are claiming. I mean, Newbie and I sat and like all of you or many of you and saw what happened. So the gaslighting here is extreme. What I read this morning was an account, and I guess it's coming out in someone who was arrested and some of what people said about what happened around this person. Apparently, there was a person, a guy, a 28-year-old guy from Florida, who I think was a Proud Boy, who shouted in a group of people, "Let's take the effing Capitol." And supposedly, according to this account of what happened, a leader of the Proud Boys, and this guy's nickname was Milkshake, so I just have to add that because they're ridiculous. Milkshake yelled, "Let's take the effing Capitol." And apparently a leader of the Proud Boys said, quote, "Let's not effing yell that, okay?" So interesting in and of itself, right? So first he yelled it because that's what he's thinking. Then someone a little more responsible is like, whatever we're doing, how about not yelling it at the top of our lungs? And apparently there's live stream video that shows him saying that, like, let's not effing yell that. And then also court documents allege that another Proud Boys leader then said, was recorded as saying, "It was Milkshake, man, idiot." So I reveal that, I state that because there are so many reasons why we need a commission of some kind to find out what happened that day. We still don't know. And there are still people with political power who had something to do with it. And that's mind-blowing in and of itself. But that one stupid little anecdote tells you it's just so layered in things that need to be unpacked. I immediately want to know who was yelling and who wasn't yelling and who's the guy that said don't yell it out loud, and so much there if I were a historian that I'd want to unpack. So I end talk about yanking us back into the present. I end by bringing us back to why we need a commission to find out the facts of January 6th, because even the smallest detail in the right context is going to tell us a lot. So people who are saying, I don't know what else there's new to find, really? Like, tell that to any historian and they will bop you over the head with a sharp object. I mean, it's like, no. Even if you're not a historian, that's false, but to a historian, really? Okay, I won't rant about that. I've ranted about that before, but I will now open things up, and Newbie is chirping. I will now open things up for questions.
Mug.
Oh, God!
I beat Carolee this week.
You did. Oh, I got to open chat again. You did beat Carolee. For a minute, I was like, am I mugging? Like, am I? I was so far gone. Okay, so this is a mug about little things that end up making a difference.
Ah, excellent.
Yay, history.
Yes.
So, rando person walks by me on the sidewalk, sees me and yells, Yay, history. And it becomes like we talk about it. It's like a slogan, it's a motto, it kind of represents a moment, you know. It's a person yelling something on the street. So, it's not that it's highly important, but it's certainly revealing about some of this moment and about, well, about Carolee. Who made the mug? Wait, let me move chat out of the way here. But it's a weird random thing. And even talk about trivial. My tweet on the back that revealed Yay History. That would be, if I were writing about public history, I would use that story from this moment. Not that it represents everything, but it would reveal something. Okay, now I'll shut up. I had a lot to say today and I didn't realize it. Okay.
I love it. This is important. So, and so background this week. Yes, of course, this is Bag End. As many of you have seen, this is Bag End from The Hobbit. The Hobbit and then the Lord of the Rings movies.
Oh, so someone guessed it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They got it pretty right away, which is
wow.
I'm super happy about because it means I'm not the only nerd in the room, but also because it's just wonderful. But nobody really picked the real reason, and so this is the reason I chose this today, which is today we are talking about small but important things. And is there anything more small but important?
Wow.
Our Hobbit friends have done. So
wow, very good.
So I went a long way for that one. Almost went with Montpelier, the because Madison was our shortest president. But I had to.
This is much better.
I had to fly my nerd flag today.
And what you have also done, Matt, is make me feel less nerdy because I never guessed. No idea. So there's one little instance in which I could feel slightly less nerdy than one other human being. I'll outdo a bunch of people in other ways, but this is one way.
Okay, so all right, so two quick things before I get to the questions, and the first is to just publicly shame everybody. I only have 2 questions so far. So again, you don't want to do that to Joanne to make me ask a whole bunch of questions. But the real thing I did want to say is that anyway, yes, please get questions in because really there are only 2 of them so far. Other thing I wanted to mention, Joanne, is you mentioned Never Caught, Erica Dunbar Armstrong's book. She also has a young adult version of the book. So those of you who are teachers out there, this is a great book. Middle school students can read this. This is like 8th grade U.S. history. This is, pull it out. So
it's such a different look from whatever's been floating around out there about so many things. So
yeah. And she also has a brand new book on Harriet Tubman, which I have not read yet, but I've heard it's pretty amazing. So, so with that, let's get to our questions. Let me open them up and see where we're at. Dave wants to know, okay, this is long, so hang with me here. What about personal habits that are informative about a person? I'm thinking of retired Admiral McRaven, who said, if you make your bed every morning, first thing, you will have accomplished the first task of the day. It will give you a small sense of pride and will encourage you to do another and another and another. By the end of the day, one task completed will have turned into many tasks completed. Seems like that sort of thing can be revealing about somebody.
Oh, for sure. And as a matter of fact, that's the precise reason why I typically make my bed every day. And of course, it's not made right now. But normally I do it because then I can feel like I did something. Like I accomplished something and like there's something in order in my life. So, but yeah, that sort of thing, it can be remarkably revealing, particularly if you're lucky enough, as in this case, to have someone explain why they think that. So it really can be the most trivial thing. I mean, I'm sure if I had more time to sit here and think, I could come up with all kinds of things that I found in the course of digging through a file or whatever that were like, oh, some light bulb goes off. And I'm like, oh, that just explained this thing that I never understood before.
Mhm.
And it's partly finding the puzzle pieces. You know, it's handy to find puzzle pieces, but personal habits, personal choices can tell you not only about character, but certainly about character, but about the choices surrounding that person at that time. I want to repeat before we go on to the next question something that's very much worth repeating, which is from Jen, who first of all said, "Awesome backdrop, Matt," and then said, "In this moment, many of us feel small and unimportant, unable to make a difference. We are not." That's such an important point. I mean, that's a point I've been ranting about for a year. That this is a moment where everyone can make a difference, and you're not small and unimportant. And democracy is us, and it's
Mhm.
little numbers of us. So I had to repeat that because I didn't think of that connection. If I had, you could be sure I would have ended my comments with it. But it's really smart and it's really important. So, okay.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think, from my private life, one of the things I've been working on in the last many years is to try to encourage people to be to run for office um, and to get involved with your local committees or your local historical societies. And these are all ways that we can be part of, as you say, small d democracy here. Small d democracy, all in capital letters. Does that sound right?
Yes.
Um,
I'm with you.
okay. Eric wants to know, I had always thought Ben Franklin was a bit of a hokey, man of the people, nice guy. But I recently read letters between him and his wife, one where she's defended their house from people coming over to burn it down, the result of his actions. And he writes, "Thanks for saving the house." And another where she talks about their daughter's wedding. And he writes, "Keep it cheap." All all of the while he's over in London, presumably having a grand time and making zero attempt to help. Was Ben not such a nice guy?
Well, that's a great question. I have not read Jill Lepore's book, so I cannot delve into more detail on the topic of Franklin's relations with. I think it was about his wife, what Jill Lepore wrote. No one's as nice as they present themselves. Like no one. So Franklin had a persona that he very carefully created, and the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin shows you him creating the persona. So it's not even like it's a hidden fact. He's like, well, if you do this, people will think you work hard. He's very carefully creating a persona. So yeah, he presented himself in a certain way. And it's also possible that in public around other important men, he presented a very different kind of a countenance, very different kind of behavior, that when it came to what he did at home, a different side of him came out. But he was not just this genial kind of, chuckly guy with full of witticisms. He had a lot of witticisms. Poor Richard means something. He was someone who really clearly could put his finger on precisely what was happening at a moment and say it in such a catchy, sharp edge kind of way that it had an impact. But yeah, there are all kinds of other sides to Franklin. I haven't studied him in depth. My Franklin knowledge that goes beyond the big story is mostly around him, around other important white guys. So it's not going to get much beyond that. But it's a good question because even without knowing anything, I can tell you, yeah, he was not such a nice guy. No one is as nice. Think about yourself. No one is as nice as they try to present themselves as being, even if you don't realize whatever the thing is that is not so good. Oop, hang on a sec.
Okay. So, Middle Earth.
I forgot to plug in my computer.
Gotcha. Okay.
I'm really sorry. I
I
unplugged.
wasn't sure if I'm going to have to riff on Middle Earth there for a little while.
No. I do this every week. I set everything up. I get the camera all adjusted, and then I remember I have to print out my notes, and then I take everything apart and print it out and come back. And this week I forgot to put anyway.
Love it. So Jeannie and Tim both are asking a similar question, and so I'm going to read Jeannie's first, and then I'll ask Tim's because they're, like, as I said, they're connected, I think. So we don't write diaries or journals as we have in the past, generally speaking. Our Twitter feeds and TikTok now are diaries. will they be preserved for historians of the future? That's Jeannie's question. And then Tim wants to know, are you worried as a historian about a digital black hole that may exist in terms of not having those diaries and personal accounts?
Those are good questions. The short answer is yes. But yes and no, right? So on the one hand, I think about all of the things in writing that survive, and not only that, but paper in the period that I mostly write about, the late 18th and early 19th century, much better quality than the stuff that comes later. So it really survives. It's more likely to survive than paper from the mid and late 19th century. You can tell the difference when you're in an archive and you get to the late stuff. You're like, it's like thin and, it's just not as good. But, so on the one hand, I can think about the fact that having things on paper is wonderful, and now what are we preserving? Like nothing. On the other hand, as a historian, when I think about doing history about the 20th century or the 21st century, there's so much freaking evidence. Like I can research something in the past and have a vague sense that I've probably gotten most of the evidence that one could grab, get one's hands on without really sort of diving in. There's no way you could ever, when you're doing modern history, it's, I don't want to say it's more complicated because there are different complications, but I'm in awe of people who do modern history because of all of the other kinds of evidence that are there. The other thing I want to mention, though, that's interesting is many years ago, I worked at the Library of Congress as an employee for their American Memory program, which was trying to put things, digitize things, collections in the library to get them out. And that stuff is still on the Library of Congress website. But I went to a meeting in the manuscript division, and what the meeting was about was, what are we saving? And particularly in the case of like the kinds of people, government people, members of Congress that would be in the Library of Congress, what are we saving? And this is the question. Like, at that point, it was long enough ago that it was like the little pink pads that say, you got this call, or, and particularly if you think about it before email, even what's lost? A lot. So there's different holes in the archive, and now some of these holes are not. They actually include, and maybe are even worse for some of these important white guys who can hide things or say things in such a way that nobody seemingly will ever know. That, on the other hand, we find all the time that people find things out. People thought they were being very sneaky about, which gets back to my first point. There's like way too many ways to find things, way too many forms of evidence. But the larger point is, I think that the technology, I said this before, technology shapes history, and it also shapes the telling of history. I think all the time about what survives. I think all the time. I mean, the sort of Amin story and the file box story I told, those are the sorts of things that stay in my mind, and all the time about what we're living through now. Just as a historian, I think, bing, like that thing, if I were writing about this moment, that would be a thing. Or a photo, like that photo, like, man, that's evidence. So yeah, it means that you get certain things you might not get in the past, and then there's a whole bunch of stuff, you're a kind of evidence that you're losing, and it'll affect the kind of history that's written. And you have to think about that when you're reading that kind of history. So what's included and what's not included, and what does that suggest?
So let's I want to continue to dig into that. Okay, now that people are actually asking questions, I want to talk about something that I heard that I really want to hear a little bit more about, and it sort of extends what you were just saying. And that is, when you were talking, you said something to the effect of, these are the evidence I have is really sort of, wealthy dead white guys, right? And one of the fascinating things about some of the work that, as you mentioned, Erica Dunbar Armstrong or Annette Gordon Reed do, is revealing the voices in historical records that are not kept, in a sense, and or that weren't kept in the same ways. Could we talk a little bit more about that? That sort of like, how do we find those little pieces of evidence that illuminate the stories that aren't part of that sort of traditional dead white guy narrative?
Sure. I mean, it can be really hard work.
Yeah.
And it starts with the simple recognition of what's not there,
Mhm.
right? Which is really easy to overlook. And if you want a sense of how easy it is to overlook, think about using a database and plugging in terms and coming up with answers and going away with your answer, and never stopping to think about what isn't in the database, right? Like there's a huge newspaper database. I use it all the time. There are newspapers that just aren't there for one reason or another. So whatever I'm doing in there is revealing things, but it's revealing a particular kind of thing. So in this case too, I think for a long time, people, and even now, people use archives and don't think about what's not there. Once you've recognized all of the gaping holes that exist and the ways in which you need to fill them, there are different ways of doing it. One way is just really hard historical work. So like using census records and looking in for legal records and using records of people to figure out where they are at a given place or time, to try and get a sense of circumstance, to connect different parts of their life, to kind of see what they're doing. That there's real detective work that's at the heart sometimes of tracking people down in that way. I have a really close friend who is doing that work. So I've been watching her do that work, try and piece together a life that's hard to piece together. But then as she does it, if she finds a court record that's really revealing and just includes a quote, like something she said, and it's like, the world opens for this person that is probably not in any historical record of any kind. So part of the answer is detective work. Part of the answer is digging in sources, resources from elite people for the kinds of clues that are going to tell you about the people around them. Wendy Warren wrote an article. I think New England Bound is the book she came out with. But when I let's see, did she do it? Anyway, she was in grad school when I was teaching, and I think she wrote this article as a grad student on a Black woman who was raped in colonial Massachusetts, maybe, and how she tried to figure out what happened to the woman and what she went through. I can't remember the name of her article, but I'm sure that you can find it. It won a prize, and what it does is try to reconstruct something that is only minimally mentioned in public records. She got some flack for it because people were like, well, how do you know? And she describes how she was drawing conclusions, but it talks about this in a really interesting way. So Wendy Warren, it's got to be at least 10 years old, but I would suggest finding it.
Okay, so I apologize. I always mispronounce it. Anissa, I hope I'm saying that correctly, is asking about time capsules.
Oh.
The phenomenon of time capsules is a late 19th century invention. The 18th century also things about preserving things in that way. Can we talk about it a little bit? It's
time capsules.
I've never thought about it in that way. I think it's really interesting.
Oh. Well, I'm always intrigued by that, partly because, even if it's a time capsule from like 1920, you're still like two things, like what is in it and what does it show? And equally important, what did they think was important to put in there, right? To reflect, like something sent to the moon, right? Isn't there like a box of things sent to the moon to like sit up there in case someone finds it? And like, what goes in that kind of a box, or things being broadcast out into space in case someone overhears it? That kind of thing is fascinating because, well, for one, it's like a treasure chest of history, but it says a lot about the people making that box and putting stuff in it. That's the most revealing part in a way, which kind of is like what I just said about the database, right? Is that you have to think about what's there and you have to think about what's not there and you have to think about who put it together to fully decode what is actually being said. But yeah, that somehow in my mind, this is going to be a totally off the wall reference, but it's what popped into my mind. Some of you who are my age maybe remember the kiddie show Bozo the Clown. Mm-hmm. And if you did a certain thing on Bozo the Clown, there was like this huge toy chest you won. It was like this massive chest was piled with toys. And as a little kid, I was like, wow, like I want to win the big chest. And in my mind, as we're talking about time capsules, that's what came into my mind. That is my toy chest.
I love it.
I probably haven't thought about that show and that toy chest for decades, but That's what a time capsule would be to me.
That's fantastic. Yeah, that I did. The when you mentioned databases, it kind of struck me. One of the things that's interesting is when you're using computers, those search terms are created by a person. They're not, you know what I mean? And
Right.
so, and that says a lot about what the person creating the search terms values, not necessarily what is in there. And so it can be hard if you're doing computer-based research through databases or journal articles or whatever to find the thing you need or that you really want to know about, because in some ways you're pushing up against contemporary people's interpretations of data entry, right?
Archives are not objective.
Correct. Yeah.
They're created by people, and they have all of the weird prejudices and gaps that whoever those people are. So it's a really good point.
Yeah.
I want to mention something too that I just saw whizzing by in chat here. Someone mentioned where is it again? Uh, what's the name of the website? Ancestry.com. Someone mentioned Ancestry.com. So here's what's interesting about that is that in my mind, Ancestry.com is like a popular database, meaning my academic databases that I can get through Yale are more deep and have more things in them. And if something's in Ancestry.com, probably it's in, big, fancy, important databases. So I never had gone to Ancestry.com. I just assumed that whatever I was finding there was not going to help me. And then I was finishing my most recent book, and there were a couple of things that if I couldn't find evidence to support what I wanted to say, they were not going to be in the book. And there was a really, to me, important one because it was so dramatic about Joshua Giddings of Ohio standing up to give an anti-slavery speech, and a Louisiana congressman standing up and facing him and pulling a gun, and then 2 or 3 Southern friends standing up and pulling their guns, and then 1 or 2 people who agreed with Giddings standing up and pulling their guns. And I had gotten the story in Giddings. Giddings wrote like a sort of autobiographical account of the politics of that period. So he tells that story, right? So I'm like, well, there's no way I can take that from him. He wants to make, the Southerners look bad. Who knows what he wants to say? So it's a great story, and I'd love to be able to say it because what does it say about the floor of Congress? But so for years, I can't say it. And every time I'm digging around, I'm like, hey, what if I search on? And the last thing I did, I was like, it's really quirky, but like maybe I should go to ancestry.com. Like I could get there through Yale, you never know. What I found, of course, was this little local Ohio newspaper, which, at the time there weren't that many newspapers in Ohio, so it would have been a bigger deal. Probably not a big enough deal to make it into the databases that I use. And it had an account of the incident, right? It was like so-and-so stood up with his gun and he was muttering under his breath. And it was like, first of all, I was like, hallelujah, I get to include the story. But then I learned from that, which is all data is data. And you can't predict what you are or aren't going to find. So I won't be snobby again, ever, about databases. It really taught me something.
So we're about out of time, so I want to ask one last question, which is from Dave, which is, do either Joanne or you keep a diary? And I think they're probably more interested in you, whether or not you keep a diary.
I try. I'm the person who has multiple diaries with like 5 pages. I try, That said, I have diaries of my travels finding Hamilton. Those I kept because to me, that was like fascinating stuff and it wasn't really about me. But as far as my life, and what's funny about that is now when I'm trying to understand some aspects of my childhood that maybe were difficult or weird, I'm going back to those 5 pages, right? I'm like, can I find anything in those? So I wish I kept a diary. As if anyone understands their importance, it's me. But I somehow have never been able to do that.
In case anyone was curious, I'm kind of the same way. I have it's buried over here, but I do have a book I keep of just like a bound journal that I keep with me at all times. And I'll jot ideas down in, but it's not a diary or a journal in that sense. The closest thing I have to a journal is my social media feeds, which is
I guess that's right, my tweets.
Incoherent ramblings of a annoying person. So
But with your book, you're one up on me, so that's
yeah,
cool.
that's true. I mean, it's nice that because it's a lot of like research ideas. So I'll be like, oh, so and so is connected to here. So here's a question I have about that, and I'll return to it if and
Yeah.
when I ever get around to it.
Yeah, no, that's smart. Okay, well, I know that it's time
It is
for the
time.
after party. So let me, as always, explain after partyness. So now what we're going to do is stop recording and segue into the after party. And what all that means is more casual conversation about whatever the heck it is we want to talk about. If you're on Facebook and want to join the after party, you need to leave Facebook and go to the NCHE website to get in, ncheteach.org/conversations. So hopefully some of you will stick around. We'll see you in the after party. If not, thank you for coming. As always, democracy needs public discourse. We are not little and insignificant. So thank you, Jen. We are creating a public discourse, and whatever motivates us out of this matters as much as anything else. So have a good week. At some time magically next week and before 8 o'clock on Thursday. I'll figure out what I want to talk about. I was working on a podcast. I was a little insane. It'll be different next week. So anyway, see you next week. Thank you for coming. Have a safe week.
All right. See everybody later.